The crisp winter air bit at Mark's cheeks as he trudged through the snow-covered forest of Yellowstone National Park. The gentle crunch of his boots on the fresh powder was the only sound breaking the stillness of the early morning. Mark had been a park ranger for over a decade, but this winter felt different. The harsh weather had driven much of the wildlife into hiding, making his usual patrols eerily quiet. As he adjusted his backpack, Mark's thoughts drifted to the recent reports of increased poaching activity in the area. The scarcity of game had made some desperate, and it was his job to protect the park's inhabitants. His fingers, despite the thick gloves, felt numb as he gripped his binoculars, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Mark noticed something unusual. Fresh tracks in the snow, larger than any deer or wolf he'd encountered before. His heart quickened as he realized what they might belong to, a bear. It was rare for bears to be active this time of year, and concern immediately washed over him. If a bear was out of hibernation, something must be wrong. Carefully, Mark followed the tracks, his trained eyes never leaving the trail. The path wound through dense pines, their branches heavy with snow. As he pushed aside a low-hanging bough, he found himself at the mouth of a small cave, partially obscured by fallen branches and drifts of snow. Mark's breath caught in his throat as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. There, not 20 feet away, lay a massive grizzly bear. Her fur was matted and dirty, and her eyes, though open, seemed glazed with exhaustion. But what truly shocked Mark was the clear swell of her belly. This bear was pregnant. Years of training kicked in as Mark slowly began to back away. He knew better than to provoke a bear, especially one in such a vulnerable state. But as he moved, a twig snapped underfoot, and the bear's head swung towards him. A low, warning growl rumbled through the cave. Freezing in place, Mark spoke in a soft, even tone, "Easy there, Mama. I'm not here to hurt you." He knew the bear couldn't understand his words, but he hoped his calm demeanor would help diffuse the tension. The bear's eyes locked onto him, filled with a mixture of fear and aggression. Mark's mind raced, assessing the situation. The bear was clearly in no condition to charge, but cornered animals were unpredictable. With agonizing slowness, he continued to back away until he was clear of the cave's entrance. Once at a safe distance, Mark let out a shaky breath. The encounter had lasted only moments, but the image of the vulnerable bear was seared into his mind. As a ranger, he had a duty to protect the park's wildlife, but this situation was complex. A pregnant bear out of hibernation was at serious risk, as were any cubs she might birth. That night, as Mark sat by the fireplace in his small cabin on the outskirts of the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something. The bear's tired eyes haunted him. He knew the risks of interfering with wildlife, but he also knew that without help, the chances of the bear and her cubs surviving were slim. After hours of internal debate, Mark made a decision. He would return to the cave, not as a ranger enforcing park rules, but as a guardian looking out for one of the park's most vulnerable inhabitants. He spent the rest of the evening preparing. He gathered some fish from his freezer, leftovers from his last fishing trip, and some berries he had dried over the summer. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to help the bear regain some strength. As he packed his bag for the next day, Mark's phone buzzed. It was a text from his colleague, Sarah. "Hey Mark, any signs of those poachers we've been hearing about?" Mark hesitated before replying. He knew he should report the bear sighting, but something held him back. If word got out, the bear could be in even more danger. Poachers would see her as an easy target. "Nothing yet," he typed back. "I'll keep you posted." It was the first time in his career that Mark had withheld information from a fellow ranger. The weight of his decision kept him awake long into the night. He told himself it was for the best, that he was protecting the bear. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind wondered if he was making a huge mistake. The next morning, Mark set out before dawn, his backpack heavy with supplies. The trek to the cave seemed longer this time, each step filled with anticipation and worry. What if the bear had left? What if she reacted aggressively to his presence? As he approached the cave, Mark began to speak softly, hoping to alert the bear to his presence without startling her. "Hey there, Mama Bear. It's just me again. I've brought you some breakfast." Slowly, cautiously, he placed the fish and berries at the entrance of the cave. Then, he retreated to what he hoped was a safe distance and waited. Time seemed to stretch as he stood there, the cold seeping through his layers of clothing. Finally, movement caught his eye. The bear emerged, her nose twitching as she scented the air. Mark held his breath as she approached the food. With surprising gentleness for such a large creature, she sniffed at the offering before starting to eat. As he watched her, Mark felt a mix of relief and something else, a connection he couldn't quite explain. This was more than just a ranger doing his duty. In that moment, he made a silent promise to the bear. He would do whatever it took to see her and her cubs through this winter. Over the next few days, Mark fell into a new routine. He would rise early, prepare food for the bear, whom he had started calling Holly in his mind, and make the trek to her cave. Each time, he spoke to her softly, trying to accustom her to his presence. Holly seemed to grow more comfortable with him. She would emerge from the cave at the sound of his voice, her initial wariness giving way to what Mark could almost swear was recognition. He made sure to keep his distance, respecting her space while providing the support she desperately needed. As the days passed, Mark's concern for Holly grew. The winter showed no signs of letting up, and he knew her body was under immense stress. Pregnant bears usually hibernated through the winter, their bodies perfectly adapted to nurture growing cubs. Holly's unusual circumstances put both her and her unborn cubs at risk. One particularly brutal day, as a blizzard raged outside, Mark battled through the storm to reach Holly's cave. The wind howled, driving snow and ice into his face, but he pressed on, driven by worry for his unconventional charge. When he finally reached the cave, his heart sank. Holly was lying just outside, her massive body shivering in the snow. She was too weak to even retreat to the shelter of her den. Panic surged through Mark. He knew that without immediate help, Holly might not survive the night. In that moment, all thoughts of park regulations and the risks of intervening flew from his mind. He had to act. Quickly, he gathered what branches he could find and built a makeshift shelter around Holly, creating a barrier against the worst of the wind. Then, using the emergency kit from his pack, he started a small fire nearby, hoping the heat would help warm her. As the flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the snow, Mark sat beside Holly. He spoke to her continuously, his voice a lifeline in the howling storm. "Come on, Holly," he urged. "You can do this. Those cubs of yours need you to be strong." Throughout the long night, Mark tended the fire and watched over Holly. He offered her water, melted from snow, and the last of the food he had brought. Gradually, her shivering subsided, and her breathing became more regular. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold, Holly stirred. She raised her head, her eyes meeting Mark's. In that moment, he saw something that took his breath away, a look of trust, perhaps even gratitude. Exhausted but relieved, Mark realized that the dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a well-meaning intruder. He had become Holly's protector, a guardian she had come to rely on. As he made his way back to his cabin that morning, Mark knew his life had been irrevocably altered. The Lone Ranger, known for his solitary nature, had forged a connection he never expected. Holly and her unborn cubs were now his responsibility, a secret he would guard with his life. Little did Mark know, as he finally allowed himself to rest, that the real challenges were yet to come. The bond between man and bear would be tested in ways he could never have imagined, as the harsh winter continued to tighten its grip on Yellowstone. As the weeks passed, Mark's dedication to Holly grew stronger. Each morning, he would rise before dawn, his small cabin filled with the aroma of coffee as he prepared for the day ahead. The routine had become second nature: pack his bag with fish, berries, and other supplies, bundle up against the biting cold, and make the trek through the snow-covered landscape of Yellowstone to Holly's cave. The park was eerily quiet during these early morning journeys. Most of the wildlife was still in hibernation, and the tourists who usually flocked to Yellowstone were long gone, driven away by the harsh winter conditions. This solitude suited Mark just fine. It allowed him to focus on his self-appointed mission without raising suspicion among his fellow rangers. As he approached Holly's cave one crisp morning, Mark noticed something different. The bear was waiting for him at the entrance, her dark eyes alert and expectant. It was a far cry from their first encounters when she would growl warningly at his approach. Now, she seemed to welcome his presence, even anticipate it. "Morning, Holly," Mark called out softly, a smile tugging at his lips. "Looks like someone's feeling better today." He placed the food at what he judged to be a respectful distance, then settled himself on a fallen log nearby. As Holly lumbered over to the offering, Mark took the opportunity to observe her closely. Her coat, once matted and dull, now had a healthier sheen. Her movements, while still slow due to her pregnancy, seemed more assured. As Holly ate, Mark talked to her in a low, soothing voice. He'd gotten into the habit of sharing the goings-on of the park with her, almost as if she were a colleague rather than a wild animal. "You'll never believe what happened yesterday," he chuckled. "Old Bill from the gift shop swears he saw Bigfoot near the geysers. Can you imagine?" Holly paused in her eating, looking up at Mark with what he could have sworn was amusement in her eyes. It was moments like these that made Mark question everything he thought he knew about wildlife. The connection he felt with Holly defied explanation. As the days wore on, Mark found himself spending more and more time at Holly's cave. He'd bring his lunch, eating his sandwiches as Holly napped nearby. Sometimes, he'd read aloud from the paperback novels he brought along, his voice a gentle backdrop to the winter stillness. One particularly cold afternoon, as Mark was engrossed in reading To Kill a Mockingbird to Holly, he almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps crunching through the snow. Startled, he quickly stuffed the book into his backpack and stood up, positioning himself between Holly and the newcomer. "Mark, is that you?" A familiar voice called out. Mark's heart sank as he recognized the voice of Sarah, his fellow ranger. He'd been so focused on Holly that he'd forgotten about his scheduled patrol with Sarah. "Yeah, it's me," he called back, trying to keep his voice casual. "Just checking out some unusual tracks I found." Sarah came into view, her red hair peeking out from under her ranger hat. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, Mark standing protectively in front of a very pregnant, very awake bear. "Mark," she said slowly, her hand instinctively moving to the tranquilizer gun at her hip. "What's going on here?" For a moment, Mark considered lying. But as he looked from Sarah to Holly, he knew it was time to come clean. Taking a deep breath, he began to explain everything. Finding Holly out of hibernation, his decision to help her, the bond they'd formed over the past weeks. Sarah listened in stunned silence, her expression a mix of disbelief and concern. When Mark finished, she shook her head. "Do you have any idea how many regulations you've broken? If the park supervisor finds out—" I know, Mark interrupted. "But Sarah, look at her. She wouldn't have survived without help. I couldn't just leave her." Sarah's gaze softened as she observed Holly, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the exchange. "She does seem different," Sarah admitted. "I've never seen a wild bear so at ease around humans." Mark saw an opportunity. "Help me, Sarah," he pleaded. "Holly's going to give birth soon. She'll need all the support she can get." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her ranger training warring with her compassion. Finally, she sighed. "All right, Mark. I won't report this. But you have to promise to be careful. And I want to help." Relief washed over Mark. Having Sarah on board not only meant an extra pair of hands but also reduced the risk of their secret being discovered. Together, they could give Holly and her cubs a fighting chance. Over the next few days, Mark and Sarah fell into a new routine. They would alternate visits to Holly, ensuring she always had food and companionship. Sarah, with her background in wildlife biology, provided valuable insights into Holly's condition and needs. One evening, as they sat by the fire in Mark's cabin, discussing Holly's progress, Sarah turned to Mark with a serious expression. "You know we can't keep this up forever, right? Once the cubs are born and strong enough, we'll have to let them go." Mark nodded, though the thought sent a pang through his heart. He'd known from the beginning that his time with Holly was temporary, but he hadn't expected to form such a strong attachment. "I know," he said softly. "But for now, let's focus on getting them through the winter." As if the weather had heard his words, a fierce storm hit Yellowstone the very next day. The wind howled through the trees, driving snow and sleet before it. Mark and Sarah battled through the blizzard to reach Holly's cave, worried about how she was faring in the extreme conditions. When they arrived, they found Holly lying outside the cave, clearly distressed. Her labored breathing and restless movements told them all they needed to know: the cubs were coming. "We need to get her inside the cave," Sarah shouted over the wind. "She's too exposed out here." Together, they worked to coax Holly back into the shelter of her den. It was slow, painstaking work. Holly was frightened and in pain, and it took all of their combined experience and the trust they'd built to finally get her settled inside. As the storm raged outside, Mark and Sarah prepared for a long night. They built a small fire near the cave entrance, providing warmth and light. Sarah's medical kit, usually reserved for injured hikers, was laid out nearby. Hours passed, marked by Holly's pained growls and the howling of the wind. Mark and Sarah took turns soothing the bear, speaking in low, calming voices. Despite the gravity of the situation, Mark couldn't help but marvel at the surreal nature of it all. Two humans helping a wild grizzly bear give birth in the middle of a Yellowstone blizzard. Just as the first light of dawn began to penetrate the storm clouds, Holly gave a final, mighty push. Sarah, who had been monitoring the birth closely, let out a triumphant cry. "It's a cub! And, wait, there's another one." Mark watched in awe as two tiny, wet bundles of fur emerged. Holly immediately began to clean them, her powerful jaws incredibly gentle as she tended to her newborns. The cave was filled with the high-pitched mewling of the cubs, a sound that brought tears to Mark's eyes. As the storm began to abate outside, a new calm settled over the cave. Holly lay exhausted but alert, her cubs nursing contentedly. Mark and Sarah sat nearby, utterly drained but exhilarated. "They're beautiful," Sarah whispered, her eyes shining with wonder. Mark could only nod, too overcome with emotion to speak. In that moment, looking at Holly and her cubs, he knew that everything, all the risks, the sleepless nights, the broken regulations, had been worth it. But as the adrenaline of the night began to fade, reality started to set in. The hardest part of their journey was just beginning. The cubs were healthy, but vulnerable. The winter was far from over, and there were still many dangers lurking in the park, both natural and human. As Mark and Sarah began to plan their next steps, they were unaware that their secret was about to become much harder to keep. The arrival of the cubs had changed everything, and forces beyond their control were already in motion. The quiet of the cave, filled only with the soft sounds of the nursing cubs, was a deceptive calm. Outside, the world of Yellowstone was stirring, and the true test of Mark and Sarah's dedication to Holly and her family was yet to come. The bond between humans and bear, forged in the crucible of a harsh winter, would soon face challenges that none of them could have anticipated. The days following the birth of Holly's cubs were filled with a mixture of joy, exhaustion, and constant vigilance for Mark and Sarah. The tiny bears, barely larger than puppies, required round-the-clock care and attention. Though Holly was proving to be an attentive mother, the unusual circumstances of their birth meant that the rangers felt compelled to keep a close watch. Mark had taken to calling the cubs Rusty and Luna. Rusty, the slightly larger of the two, had a reddish tint to his fur, while Luna's coat was a darker, more silvery shade. Despite Sarah's gentle reminders about not getting too attached, Mark couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the little family. "They're getting stronger every day," Sarah remarked one crisp morning as they observed the cubs fumbling around the cave entrance. Holly watched her offspring with a mixture of pride and wariness, her eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. Mark nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "They sure are. Rusty there seems to have a real adventurous streak. Reminds me of my nephew back in Ohio." As if on cue, Rusty stumbled over a small rock, tumbling head over paws before coming to rest against his mother's side. Holly gently nudged him back to his feet with her nose, earning a squeak of protest from the cub. The scene was so domestic, so seemingly normal, that Mark almost forgot the gravity of their situation. They were, after all, interfering with wild animals in a national park. If word got out about what they were doing, the consequences could be severe. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah spoke up. "Mark, we need to start thinking about an exit strategy. The cubs are doing well, but they can't stay here forever. Once spring comes..." Mark sighed, running a hand through his beard, which had grown considerably since this adventure began. I know. But we can't just abandon them. Holly's still weak from the birth, and the cubs are too young to fend for themselves. Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. We won't abandon them. But we need to start preparing them for life in the wild. That's where they belong, Mark. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the cave. Luna had managed to climb onto Holly's back and was now perched there, surveying her domain with what could only be described as a look of smug satisfaction. The sight was so comical that both rangers burst into laughter, the serious discussion momentarily forgotten. As the weeks passed, the cubs grew rapidly, their personalities becoming more distinct with each passing day. Rusty was indeed the more adventurous of the two, always the first to investigate new sights and sounds. Luna, on the other hand, was more cautious but incredibly curious, often observing her surroundings with an almost human-like intensity. Mark and Sarah continued their daily visits, now not just bringing food for Holly but also introducing elements that would help prepare the cubs for life in the wild. They brought different plants and berries, letting the cubs sniff and taste them under Holly's watchful eye. They even introduced recordings of other animal sounds, hoping to accustom the young bears to the various inhabitants of the forest. One particularly memorable afternoon, Mark arrived at the cave to find Sarah already there, a look of excitement on her face. "Mark, you've got to see this," she whispered, gesturing for him to approach quietly. As he drew closer, Mark saw what had Sarah so thrilled. Rusty and Luna were play-fighting, rolling and tumbling in the snow just outside the cave. Their moves, though clumsy, were already showing signs of the powerful predators they would one day become. Holly sat nearby, her eyes never leaving her cubs. But what struck Mark was her relaxed posture. She seemed completely at ease with the presence of the two humans, a far cry from the wary, aggressive bear they had first encountered months ago. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Sarah murmured. "How far they've come." Mark nodded, unable to find words to express the emotion welling up inside him. This unlikely family had become such an integral part of his life that he could hardly remember what his days were like before Holly and the cubs. As spring began to make its presence felt in Yellowstone, the changes in the forest were mirrored by changes in the bear family. Holly was venturing further from the cave, teaching her cubs to forage for the early spring vegetation. Mark and Sarah watched with a mixture of pride and sadness as the bears became more independent, requiring less and less of their intervention. "They're almost ready," Sarah said one evening as they watched Holly leading her cubs to a nearby stream. The bears splashed in the shallow water, the cubs enthusiastically pouncing on fish under their mother's guidance. Mark knew she was right, but the thought of saying goodbye filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. "Yeah," he replied softly. "I guess they are." As they turned to head back to their cabins, a noise in the underbrush caught their attention. Mark's hand instinctively went to his tranquilizer gun, while Sarah scanned the area, her body tense. A moment later, a young moose burst into the clearing, clearly spooked by something. The animal's sudden appearance startled Holly, who immediately rose to her full height, placing herself between the perceived threat and her cubs. Mark and Sarah held their breath, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate the situation. Holly let out a warning growl, her protective instincts in full force. To their amazement, Rusty and Luna, instead of cowering behind their mother, moved to flank her. Though still small, the cubs puffed out their chests and attempted to mimic Holly's intimidating stance. The moose, realizing it was outnumbered, quickly changed course and disappeared back into the forest. As the tension dissipated, Mark and Sarah exchanged glances of relief and pride. "Did you see that?" Mark whispered excitedly. "The way they backed her up. That was incredible." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining. "They're learning, Mark. They're becoming real wild bears." The incident served as a powerful reminder of the true nature of the animals they had been caring for. Holly and her cubs were not pets or attractions, but wild creatures with instincts and abilities beyond human understanding. As they made their way back to the ranger station, Mark and Sarah began to seriously discuss their plans for transitioning the bear family back into the wild. It was a bittersweet conversation, filled with both excitement for the bear's future and sadness at the thought of saying goodbye. "We'll need to start reducing our visits," Sarah said, her voice tinged with regret. "They need to learn to survive without our help." Mark nodded, knowing she was right but finding it hard to accept. Maybe we could tag them, he suggested. Just so we can keep an eye on their progress. Sarah considered this for a moment. It's not a bad idea. We could pitch it as a conservation study to the park supervisor. That way, we'd have an official reason to monitor them. As they hammered out the details of their plan, neither of them noticed the vehicle parked just off the main road, its occupants watching their every move with keen interest. The next morning, as Mark prepared for what he knew would be one of his last regular visits to Holly and the cubs, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something felt off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Shrugging off his concerns, he shouldered his pack and set out into the gradually awakening forest. The signs of spring were everywhere now: buds on the trees, the first wildflowers poking through the melting snow, and the increased activity of the park's wildlife. As he approached the now familiar clearing near Holly's cave, Mark's steps slowed. The usual sounds of the cubs playing or Holly's low grunts were absent. An eerie silence hung over the area. "Holly," he called out softly, his hand moving instinctively to his tranquilizer gun. "Rusty. Luna." There was no response. Heart pounding, Mark moved closer to the cave entrance. As he peered inside, his blood ran cold. The cave was empty, with no sign of Holly or the cubs. But what made his breath catch in his throat was the unmistakable sign of a struggle: tufts of fur scattered about, deep claw marks in the earth, and most alarmingly, what looked like tire tracks leading away from the clearing. In that moment, as the gravity of the situation hit him, Mark realized that their secret was out. Someone had discovered Holly and the cubs, and now they were gone. The peaceful world they had created over the past months had been shattered in an instant. With shaking hands, Mark pulled out his radio. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We've got a problem. A big problem." As he waited for Sarah's response, staring at the empty cave that had once been home to his unlikely bear family, Mark knew that their real challenge was just beginning. The bond between man and bear was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined, and the peaceful forests of Yellowstone were about to become the stage for a desperate race against time. Sarah's boots crunched on the forest floor as she raced towards the clearing, her breath coming in short gasps. Mark's frantic call had sent a chill down her spine, and the usual peacefulness of the Yellowstone morning was lost on her as she focused solely on reaching her destination. As she burst into the clearing, she found Mark kneeling by the cave entrance, his face a mask of distress. "Mark," she called out. "What happened? Where are Holly and the cubs?" Mark looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "They're gone, Sarah. Someone took them." Sarah felt her heart drop. She'd known their secret couldn't last forever, but she'd never imagined it would end like this. As she surveyed the scene, taking in the signs of struggle and the ominous tire tracks, her ranger training kicked in. "We need to call this in," she said, reaching for her radio. Mark's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Wait. If we report this, we'll have to explain everything. We'll lose our jobs, Sarah. Maybe even face criminal charges." Sarah hesitated, torn between her duty as a ranger and her commitment to Holly and the cubs. "Mark, we don't have a choice. Whoever took them could be long gone by now. We need help." After a moment of tense silence, Mark nodded, releasing her wrist. As Sarah made the call, reporting a possible wildlife theft without going into the full details of their involvement, Mark began to search the area for any clues they might have missed. Within an hour, the quiet clearing had become a hive of activity. Park police, fellow rangers, and even a few FBI agents specializing in wildlife crime had descended on the scene. Mark and Sarah found themselves separated, each being questioned about their discovery of the missing bears. "And you just happened to be in this remote area of the park?" a stern-faced FBI agent asked Mark, his tone skeptical. Mark swallowed hard, sticking to the story he and Sarah had hastily agreed upon. "We'd been tracking unusual bear activity in the area. With the warm winter, some bears were coming out of hibernation early. We were concerned about potential human-wildlife conflicts." The agent made a note in his pad, his expression unreadable. As the questioning continued, Mark felt the weight of each lie, each omission, pressing down on him. But the thought of Holly and the cubs in danger steeled his resolve. He would face whatever consequences came his way, but not until the bears were safe. As the day wore on, a clearer picture began to emerge. Tire tracks matched those of a large van or small truck. Traces of tranquilizer darts were found, suggesting the bears had been drugged before being transported. But the most chilling discovery came in the form of a dropped business card, partially obscured by mud, bearing the logo of a traveling circus. Cirque de la Lune, Sarah read aloud, her voice tight with anger. I've heard of these guys. They've been accused of wildlife trafficking before, but always managed to wiggle out of charges. Mark felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. They had a lead, but the thought of Holly and the cubs being treated as circus attractions made his blood boil. We need to find them, he said, his voice low and determined. Sarah nodded, but her expression was worried. Mark, we can't just go charging off. We're already in deep trouble here. The park supervisor is talking about suspending us pending a full investigation. As if on cue, they heard their names being called. Park Supervisor Dave Hawkins was striding towards them, his face like a thundercloud. Thompson. Rodriguez. My office, now. The walk to Hawkins' office felt like a march to the gallows. As they entered, the supervisor closed the door behind them with a decisive click. Sit, he ordered, pointing to the chairs in front of his desk. As Mark and Sarah complied, Hawkins leaned against his desk, arms crossed. Now, would either of you like to explain to me what the hell is going on? And don't even think about feeding me that line about tracking unusual bear activity. I want the truth, all of it. Mark and Sarah exchanged a glance. In that moment, a silent agreement passed between them. They had come too far, risked too much, to back down now. Taking a deep breath, Mark began to speak. He told Hawkins everything, finding Holly out of hibernation, the decision to help her, the birth of the cubs, and their months-long effort to prepare the bear family for life in the wild. As he spoke, he could see the supervisor's expression shifting from anger to disbelief to something that looked almost like grudging admiration. When Mark finished, Hawkins was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice gruff but not unkind. You two do realize the shit storm you've brought down on yourselves, don't you? Interfering with wildlife, falsifying reports. I ought to fire you both on the spot. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes pleading. We know we broke the rules, sir. But right now, there's a mother bear and 2 cubs out there who need our help. We're asking for a chance to make this right. Hawkins ran a hand over his face, sighing deeply. You're both damn lucky that I've got a soft spot for bears. All right, here's what we're going to do. You've got 48 hours to find these bears and bring them back. If you succeed, we'll talk about how to handle this situation. If you fail, you're both out of a job and I'll personally see to it that you never work in wildlife conservation again. Understood. Mark and Sarah nodded vigorously, relief washing over them. As they stood to leave, Hawkins added, and for God's sake, be careful. These circus people aren't known for playing nice. With their unexpected reprieve, Mark and Sarah threw themselves into the search. They pored over maps, made countless phone calls, and reached out to every contact they had in the world of wildlife protection. By nightfall, they had a solid lead. A Cirque de la Lune convoy had been spotted heading east, towards a small town on the outskirts of the park. As they prepared to set out at first light, Mark found himself standing at the edge of the forest, looking out over the darkened landscape of Yellowstone. The enormity of what they were attempting hit him full force. They were 2 park rangers going up against an organized wildlife trafficking ring. The odds were not in their favor. Sarah joined him, her presence a comforting warmth in the cool night air. Having second thoughts, she asked softly. Mark shook his head. No. I'm scared as hell, but I'm not backing down. Holly and the cubs, they're family now, as crazy as that sounds. And you don't abandon family. Sarah smiled, bumping his shoulder with hers. Well said, partner. Now let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we bring our bears home. As they turned back towards their cabins, neither of them noticed the pair of eyes watching from the shadows. The observer smiled to himself, pleased with what he had overheard. The boss would be very interested to know that the rangers were on their trail. It was time to prepare a warm welcome for their pursuers. In the pre-dawn light, Mark and Sarah set out, their park ranger truck loaded with supplies and their hearts heavy with determination. As they drove through the awakening landscape of Yellowstone, both were acutely aware that this might be their last mission as rangers. But the thought of Holly, Rusty, and Luna in the hands of traffickers pushed all other concerns aside. The road ahead was long and fraught with danger, but Mark and Sarah were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The bond between humans and bears, forged in the wilderness of Yellowstone, was about to be tested in ways they could never have imagined. And as the sun rose over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, the race to save Holly and her cubs began in earnest. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Mark and Sarah's truck rumbled into the small town of Pinewood, just outside Yellowstone's eastern border. The streets were quiet, most of the town's residents still tucked away in their beds. But for the two rangers, sleep was a distant memory. "There," Sarah said, pointing to a faded billboard on the outskirts of town. "Cirque de la Lune, performing for one night only." Mark pulled the truck over, his eyes scanning the advertisement. "Tonight at the county fairgrounds," he read aloud. "Sarah, if they're planning to use Holly and the cubs in their show, then we don't have much time," Sarah finished, her voice tight with urgency. They drove towards the fairgrounds, the knot in Mark's stomach tightening with each passing mile. As they approached, they could see a collection of trailers and tents being set up in the early morning light. Circus workers moved about, their voices carrying on the crisp air. "We can't just walk in there," Sarah whispered as they parked at a safe distance. "We need a plan." Mark nodded, his mind racing. "Okay, here's what we'll do. You create a distraction, say you're from the local health department, doing a surprise inspection. While you keep them occupied, I'll sneak around back and try to find Holly and the cubs." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's your plan?" "Mark, that's insane. What if you get caught? Do you have a better idea?" Mark challenged, his voice rising slightly with frustration and fear. Before Sarah could respond, a sharp tap on the window made them both jump. A local sheriff's deputy was peering in at them, his expression curious and slightly suspicious. "Everything all right here?" he asked as Mark rolled down the window. Mark and Sarah exchanged a quick glance before Sarah leaned over, flashing her ranger badge. "Officer, we're so glad you're here. We're with Yellowstone National Park, tracking some stolen wildlife. We have reason to believe they might be here at the circus." The deputy's eyebrows shot up. "Stolen wildlife? Here in Pinewood?" Over the next few minutes, Mark and Sarah filled the deputy in on their situation, carefully omitting the details of their personal involvement with Holly and the cubs. To their relief and surprise, the deputy, whose name was Jim, seemed genuinely concerned. "I always thought there was something off about that circus," Jim said, shaking his head. "Tell you what, I'll help you. We'll do this by the book, get a warrant, bring in backup. No heroics, all right?" Mark wanted to argue, to insist that they didn't have time for bureaucracy, but Sarah's hand on his arm stopped him. She was right, they needed to do this legally if they wanted any chance of saving Holly and the cubs without losing their jobs in the process. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Jim called in favors, expediting the warrant process. Mark and Sarah reached out to their supervisor, updating him on the situation. By mid-afternoon, a small army of law enforcement had gathered at the sheriff's office, local deputies, state troopers, and even a couple of FBI agents specializing in wildlife crime. As they geared up for the raid, Mark felt a mix of anticipation and dread. What if they were too late? What if Holly and the cubs had already been moved? The convoy of unmarked vehicles pulled up to the fairgrounds just as the evening crowd was starting to arrive for the circus. Jim, now in plain clothes, approached the ticket booth, flashing his badge discreetly. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed out, amplified by a megaphone. "This is a law enforcement operation. Please calmly make your way to the exits. I repeat, this is not a drill." Confusion rippled through the crowd, but years of post-9/11 security drills kicked in, and people began to file out in a relatively orderly fashion. Mark and Sarah, vests emblazoned with wildlife officer, moved swiftly through the fairgrounds, followed by their law enforcement backup. They could hear shouts of protest from circus employees, the sound of cages being hastily locked. There, Sarah called out, pointing to a large, covered trailer near the back of the grounds. Even from a distance, they could hear the unmistakable sound of a distressed bear. As they approached, a burly man stepped out of the trailer, his face a mask of defiance. "You got a warrant," he growled. Jim stepped forward, waving the document. "Right here. Step aside, sir." For a moment, it seemed the man might resist, but faced with the overwhelming force of law enforcement, he grudgingly moved away. Mark's heart was pounding as he climbed into the trailer. The interior was dark, filled with the musty smell of animals and fear. As his eyes adjusted, he saw them, 3 cages, barely large enough for their occupants to turn around. In the largest cage, Holly paced back and forth, her eyes wild with stress and confusion. In the smaller cages, Rusty and Luna huddled, whimpering softly. "Oh God," Sarah breathed as she entered behind Mark. "What have they done to them?" The bears were a far cry from the healthy, vibrant animals they had left in Yellowstone. Their fur was matted, their eyes dull. Mark could see patches where fur had been rubbed away by the tight confines of the cages. As they approached, Holly let out a low growl, not of aggression but of fear. It broke Mark's heart to see the bear who had come to trust them so completely now recoiling from their presence. "It's okay, girl," he said softly, fighting back tears. "We're here to take you home." Outside, they could hear the sounds of arrests being made, of evidence being catalogued. But in the trailer, time seemed to stand still as Mark and Sarah worked to calm the bears they had come to love as family. It took hours to safely sedate and transport Holly and the cubs. By the time they were loaded into a specially equipped wildlife transport vehicle, the sun was peeking over the horizon once again. As they began the journey back to Yellowstone, Mark and Sarah rode in the transport vehicle, unwilling to leave the bears' side. The cubs, still groggy from the sedation, curled up together, while Holly watched the humans warily from her larger enclosure. "What do you think will happen now?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes never leaving the bears. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. They can't go back to the wild, not right away at least. They'll need rehabilitation, time to recover from this trauma." As if sensing his distress, Holly let out a soft grunt, her eyes meeting Mark's. In that moment, despite everything they had been through, Mark felt a rekindling of the connection they had forged over those long winter months. "We'll figure it out," he said, more to Holly than to Sarah. "Whatever happens, we'll make sure you're safe." The truck rumbled on towards Yellowstone, carrying its precious cargo back to the only home they had ever known. For Mark and Sarah, the future was uncertain. There would be hearings, possibly reprimands, maybe even the end of their careers as rangers. But as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The unlikely bond between humans and bears, forged in the wilderness and tested in the face of adversity, had emerged stronger than ever. As Yellowstone's familiar landscape came into view, Mark felt a sense of homecoming. Not just for Holly and the cubs, but for himself as well. Whatever the future held, he knew that his life had been irrevocably changed by this extraordinary adventure. The bears were safe, justice had been served, and as they crossed the border into the park, Mark allowed himself a small smile. The journey wasn't over, in many ways, it was just beginning. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to know that they had done the right thing, against all odds. As the truck wound its way deeper into the park, towards the rehabilitation center where Holly and the cubs would begin their recovery, Mark and Sarah exchanged a look of understanding. This was not the end of their story with these bears, but rather the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, challenges, and the enduring power of the connection between humans and the wild world they sought to protect. The Yellowstone Wildlife Rehabilitation Center bustled with activity as the early morning sun cast long shadows across the valley. It had been 3 months since Holly and her cubs had been rescued from the circus, and their recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Mark stood at the observation deck, a cup of steaming coffee in his hand, watching as Holly led Rusty and Luna through their morning exercises in the sprawling enclosure below. "They're looking good," Sarah remarked, joining him at the railing. "Dr. Martinez says their latest checkup was all positive." Mark nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "They've come a long way. Remember how scared they were when we first brought them here?" The memory of those first few weeks was etched deeply in both their minds. Holly had been wary and aggressive, the trauma of her captivity evident in every snarl and swipe. The cubs, once so playful and curious, had huddled together, shrinking away from human contact. It had taken weeks of patient work by the rehabilitation staff, with Mark and Sarah's constant presence, to begin to undo the damage inflicted by the circus. "Officer Thompson, Officer Rodriguez," a voice called from behind them. They turned to see Park Supervisor Hawkins approaching, his expression unreadable. "Sir," they responded in unison, straightening up instinctively. Hawkins joined them at the railing, his eyes scanning the bear enclosure below. "I've just gotten off the phone with the review board," he said, his voice gruff. "They've reached a decision regarding your unorthodox actions." Mark and Sarah exchanged a quick glance. This was the moment they'd been dreading for months. Their careers, their futures, all hung in the balance. Hawkins cleared his throat. "The board has decided, given the extenuating circumstances and the positive outcome of your intervention, to issue an official reprimand rather than termination." The relief that washed over them was palpable. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "However," Hawkins continued, "there are conditions. You'll both be required to complete an extensive training program on proper wildlife management protocols. And you'll be on probation for the next year." "We understand, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "Thank you for giving us this second chance." Hawkins nodded, his stern expression softening slightly. "You two took one hell of a risk. But I can't deny the results." He gestured towards the bears below. "You didn't just save those bears. Your actions led to the takedown of a major wildlife trafficking ring. The FBI is still making arrests based on the evidence we uncovered." As they watched, Rusty attempted to climb a small tree in the enclosure, his claws scrabbling against the bark. Luna, ever the more cautious of the two, watched from below, as if studying her brother's technique. "So, what happens to them now?" Mark asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice. Hawkins sighed. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The rehab team thinks they're making excellent progress. Holly's regained much of her natural wariness of humans, which is good. The cubs are learning essential survival skills. But," Sarah prompted, sensing there was more. "But," Hawkins continued, "there's no guarantee they can be safely released back into the wild. Holly might manage, but the cubs, they've had too much human contact. There's a risk they might seek out human settlements, which could be dangerous for them and for people. The weight of their actions, the unintended consequences of their well-meaning intervention, settled heavily on Mark and Sarah's shoulders." "What are our options?" Mark asked. "We're exploring a few possibilities," Hawkins replied. "There's a wildlife sanctuary in Montana that's expressed interest in taking them. They have a large, protected area where the bears could roam freely but still be monitored. It's not ideal, but it might be the best compromise." As they discussed the possibilities, a commotion from the enclosure drew their attention. Luna had finally decided to attempt the tree climb, with Holly watching attentively from below. The young bear's ascent was slow but determined, her movements becoming more confident with each branch. "Look at that," Sarah breathed, a note of pride in her voice. "She's doing it." They watched in silence as Luna made it to the top of the small tree, letting out a triumphant growl that echoed across the valley. Rusty, not to be outdone, immediately began scaling a nearby tree, turning the moment into an impromptu climbing competition. Hawkins chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, when I first became a ranger, an old-timer told me something I've never forgotten. He said, our job isn't just to manage the wilderness, it's to protect the magic." I didn't really understand what he meant back then. But watching this, he gestured towards the bears. "I think I'm starting to get it." As the morning wore on, Mark and Sarah found themselves drawn into discussions about the future not just for Holly and the cubs, but for Yellowstone and its wildlife. Their experience had given them a unique perspective, one that blended the practical realities of wildlife management with a deep, personal understanding of the animals they sought to protect. "We've been thinking," Sarah began tentatively, glancing at Mark for support. "What if we developed a new program? Something that combines rehabilitation with education? Mark nodded eagerly. We could use Holly and the cubs as a case study. Teach people about the complexities of human-wildlife interaction, the dangers of wildlife trafficking, the importance of preserving natural habitats. Hawkins listened thoughtfully, stroking his chin. It's an interesting idea. Risky, though. We'd have to be very careful about how we present it. We don't want to encourage others to intervene with wildlife the way you two did. Of course not, Mark agreed quickly. But maybe our experience could serve as a cautionary tale. Show people the unintended consequences of even well-meaning actions. As they continued to brainstorm, the possibilities seemed to multiply. A visitor center focused on bear conservation, guided tours that emphasized responsible wildlife viewing, partnerships with schools to foster a new generation of conservation-minded citizens. You know, Hawkins said finally, a hint of a smile on his face, this just might work. It'll take a lot of planning, a lot of approvals, but I think you might be onto something here. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm light across the Yellowstone Valley, Mark felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced since those first days of caring for Holly and her cubs. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and potential pitfalls. But as he watched the bear family below, now lounging contentedly in the morning sun, he knew that every step of this journey had been worth it. Sarah nudged him gently. Look, she whispered, pointing to the edge of the enclosure. A young elk had wandered close to the fence, drawn by the lush grass growing there. Holly immediately perked up, her posture shifting from relaxed to alert in an instant. The cubs, picking up on their mother's change in demeanor, quickly moved to flank her. For a tense moment, the bears and the elk regarded each other across the barrier. Then, with a snort and a shake of its antlers, the elk turned and ambled away. Holly watched it go, her eyes tracking its movement until it disappeared into the trees. That right there, Hawkins said softly, that's what it's all about. Keeping that balance, preserving these moments. That's the real work of a ranger. As they stood there, watching the bears return to their morning routines, Mark felt a profound sense of connection to the animals, to the park, to the very essence of the wild world they had sworn to protect. The journey that had begun on that cold winter day, with an unexpected encounter in a snowy forest, had led them here, to this new beginning. The challenges ahead were many, the path uncertain. But as Mark looked out over the Yellowstone landscape, alive with the promise of a new day, he knew that they were exactly where they needed to be. This was more than a job, more than a calling. It was a responsibility to protect the magic of the wild, to preserve these precious moments for generations to come. As if sensing his thoughts, Holly looked up, her eyes meeting Mark's across the distance. In that moment of connection, Mark felt the weight of their shared journey, the trust they had built, the obstacles they had overcome, the bond that had been forged in the face of adversity. With a soft grunt, Holly turned away, guiding her cubs towards a patch of berries growing at the edge of their enclosure. Mark watched them go, a mixture of emotions welling up inside him. There was sadness, yes, at the knowledge that these bears might never truly be wild again. But there was also hope, pride, and a deep sense of purpose. Whatever the future held, Mark knew that the story of Holly and her cubs, and the humans who had risked everything to save them, would continue to inspire and educate. It was a testament to the enduring connection between humans and the natural world, a reminder of our responsibility to protect and preserve the wild places and creatures that make our world so extraordinary. As the morning turned to afternoon, Mark, Sarah, and Hawkins made their way back to the ranger station, their minds buzzing with plans and possibilities. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the magic of Yellowstone, and the incredible creatures that called it home, would continue to inspire, challenge, and amaze for generations to come.